Welcome to this best of edition of the Vital Health Podcast. I'm Dwayne Schultes, the CEO of Vital Transformation. Today I'm revisiting previous conversations I've had with MEP Pernille Weiss and Niklas Blomberg of the EU's Innovative Health Initiative. Before leaving the European Parliament, Pernille Weiss was the rapporteur of the EU's General Pharmaceutical Legislation, the GPL, requesting many revisions to that legislation and pushing back against the European Commission. Our conversation was originally released on September 4th, 2024. When the General Pharmaceutical Legislation, the GPL, came into play in the Parliament after it had come out of the European Commission, you were asked to be the rapporteur. I think to a lot of our listeners, the comitology of the European Commission is just completely impossible to unweed. What exactly is a rapporteur? What does that mean practically? What were you doing?
Well, you sit at the front end of the table and you design the process together with the team of civil servants to make it possible to create as largest majority as possible to the Parliament's suggestion for the new regulation, the new directive. It is a package. You have a regulation and you have the directive, and I was appointed as rapporteur for the directive. So I took down, of course, the Commission's proposal, and I made my own changes to that. And after a couple of weeks, then my colleagues that are named as shadow rapporteurs, that they are representing other political groups. I am, of course, representing EPP because I am an EPP. And then I merged all the proposals for amendments coming from each political group and also every individual who wanted to participate with amendments. You try to knit a compromise proposal. And of course, you can't satisfy everybody, but then the negotiations between the shadow rapporteurs and me as a rapporteur over a span of meetings develop into something that is then both a common shared language and understanding of what is this directive really about, right? Which amendments fit each other, and how can we, by the end of the day, create a majority for the voting in both the committee, the ENVI committee, and lastly in the plenary.
But that puts you front and center and square in the target of everything that's going on in Brussels. What was the experience like? I mean, I'm sure you were hunted to near extinction, I would think.
Absolutely. And you also know my other educations that I have, besides from being a nurse, and they are all in health and academics and in innovation. So being somehow one who see a little bit more of the complexity than many of my colleagues do, because I am a part of the healthcare system. I've learned how the healthcare system, both in my country and in Europe, look alike and doesn't look alike. Right. So you see the complexity. The way that I am a politician is that I really like to work with evidence-based policy design. That stems from my years in my consultancy company, Archimed, because we worked with evidence-based design, trying to make architecture in healthcare really do what architecture and interior design can do for patient safety, for work environment, for the economy, for facility management, etc., etc. So being a politician who really likes to do evidence-based policy making is a lot about facilitation between different viewpoints, but also different levels of understanding of what is this GPL about. We try to design a kind of a learning curve or a learning journey with the fellow shadow rapporteurs, because a lot of amendments, they come from good intentions. All politicians who engage in a topic and write amendments, they do it because they want to participate and contribute, creating value. But sometimes you write an amendment without really understanding how it could fit the purpose. And especially when it comes to pharma legislation that is so super complex and is a legislation that should be able to work not only in the European Union, but also to deliver on the end results on the patient side in each member state, each of our 27 member states. And each member state has its own design of healthcare system. And that's why the output, so the end result that each citizen experiences in their daily life, is being taken through a very complex equation in each member state. But the legislation that covers pharmaceuticals is somehow something that is uniform, but it works in different ways in different healthcare systems. So being able to help colleagues to understand that there is no such thing as a jump to conclusion. We want, for example, every European citizen to have XYZ pharmaceutical product in their hand by this year. That we cannot decide in Brussels. Never ever, because the treaty is that healthcare systems, and also especially when it comes to pharmaceuticals, it is by the end of the day the member state who decide pricing and reimbursement. So it's the member state who decide whether or not X or Y pharmaceutical product is being available for the citizens in that specific country. So this fundamental rule, we had to use a lot of time really to get it into our blood, into our way of understanding, okay, given that fact, how can we then, by the legislation, stimulate the member states to maybe work a little bit more conscious and a little bit more innovative in how to design their part of the deal, so their part of how their healthcare system works, in order that this sense of envy that we have in Europe for the moment, when we realize there is actually a big of a difference between what you can get as medicine in one country compared to another country. And maybe it is not because of Brussels that is the result. Maybe the reason is decisions made in the specific healthcare system in the specific member state. And that we really had to use a lot of time to digest. Us as a collegium of negotiators to align, okay, this is the playing field that we can work with. We cannot change the healthcare models of each member state. We have to understand that.
There's so much there I want to talk about.
Yep.
Here we are sitting in Copenhagen, Denmark. It's a beautiful day. Last time I was here, it was 1 degree and sleet.
But yesterday it was pouring rain.
So I got lucky. We got lucky. Yeah. But, you have now Novo Nordisk. The Danish GDP is eclipsed by the market capitalization right now of Novo Nordisk. It's one of the largest companies in Europe right now.
In the world.
In the world. The biotech sector is thriving in Denmark. It's absolutely, as we'd say in the US, it's crushing it. It's absolutely crushing it. And you're seeing this huge ecosystem starting to develop here. You've got a dozen startups right now this year in Copenhagen, in and around Novo Nordisk, not just in biotech, but the whole biotech ecosystem. Do you see that there should be a continued reliance on the member states, or do you see conflict now? Because there is, if you look at some of the discussions around unifying HTA and centralizing procedures, how do you see this moving right now? Are you concerned about this idea to try and centralize and homogenize the process? Do you think it's working well now?
Well, what would be very, very valuable to the Union is that each member state, every member state together as a group, somehow designed a better condition for how to learn from each other. How to understand each other's efforts, instruments, incentives, and outputs. To be more curious about, okay, if they can get that quality from the money that they spend on healthcare in that country, what can we learn from that? Because to be honest, by the end of the day, it's also about if you don't spend a lot of money in healthcare systems in your country,
you're not going to get a lot.
You don't going to get a lot. And that's a part of what we did in the negotiations, that I sometimes also had to insinuate the point that as long as your country is not spending that much of money, you can't expect the union to pay for what your own government will not prioritize. I hope for the future there will be more positive curiosity in how can we learn from each other, but also respect the fact that healthcare systems is something like a living molecule where the atoms are always somehow changing and in interaction with each other. So we can't have one uniform molecule that works the same way in every 27 countries. That is not possible. But that's also a blessing, because that is the innovative foundation that for many, many, many hundred years actually has made Europe a very innovative culture. There's always something to be curious about. There's always something to be doubtful about whether we've done it the brilliant way or not. And the only way to know how to maybe do better tomorrow is that your neighbor is doing things a little bit different than you do yourself. But what we need right now in Europe and in the Union is the facilitation of that kind of learning approach and learning curve. Then maybe in 50 years, a lot of things of how we do healthcare will look alike, but it grow from bottom up. And that's where then the legislation that comes from Brussels must allow and stimulate for many different ways to use the law in each member state so that it fits the context, and also that the output that the patients and the families and the healthcare professionals, they experience, that they can see, okay, it makes sense. It has a meaningfulness when we want to understand why is our quality like this compared to the quality that the neighbor country is experiencing. And then you should say, instead of, it's because of the nerds and the bureaucrats in Brussels, they have decided that we should be punished. Instead of that, you should say, okay, that's really interesting. What did they do different? Was it because of skills? Was it because of patient information? Was it because of a different way of combining healthcare professionals with all the many different educations that you can blend around a patient journey by also putting the patient in the center, etc., etc.? And how is the case mix between... One thing is what pharmaceuticals can do, but what about training? What about education of the patient and the family? What about the workplace? I mean, you also have an employer who maybe is willing to also do more to help you to stay to the service of the company where you used to work full-time. Maybe you for a period of time only can do half-time, but you can stay by doing things a little bit more patient-centered. That I really, really hope will happen. And of course, the GPL and the pharma package in itself should do that. Pharmaceutical industries, innovative industries, generic industries, everybody in health and life science worldwide should think about Europe as that's the place to be, because there is so much happening. There is such an innovative, positive, curious approach to healthcare that is where we really can innovate. That's really where we can learn from each other. That is what the pharma package should do. It should be this magnet of attraction to everything new that can be put in the favor of making it possible for each human being living in Europe to live the life exactly how they want, no matter what you have of diagnosis.
And that's all extremely lofty, and it sounds wonderful, but the reality is when you look at the package that came to you, that was handed to you, that you had to deal with, essentially the big incentive was we're going to force and take away 2 years of your regulatory data protection. We're just going to take that from you, and then we're going to say, okay, if you do certain things like enter all 27 EU member states, we're going to give some of that back to you. The problem is we looked at those incentives and we said, okay, even if you can maximize your usage of the incentives, and I'm putting that in air quotes, where you get 12 years in the market in Europe, the fact is you're going to lose $1.2 billion, 1 billion euros in our cohort. Why do you think there was a belief that this would actually work? I mean, to come to the baseline here, why were these things seen as feasible when in fact they're going to cost money and increase the likelihood that people are not going to enter markets?
Well, you have to ask the Commission. To be honest, their proposal, we changed it. And that's also what I hear now in the hallways, that the Commission is still a little bit annoyed.
Congratulations,
to say it mildly, that what we developed in the negotiations in the European Parliament actually is more realistic, is more friendly to innovation, will make Europe more attractive for both the generics and the innovative medicine. Because this principle that you can only get up to 8 years of data protection if you launch in each member state, that is such a naive proposal to do and disrespectful to the fact that it says in the treaty that each member state decide themselves whether or not they want to offer reimbursement for a product. So it is a member state decision, and you can't put it on the pharmaceutical businesses alone to be responsible whether or not that will happen. So if the Commission's proposal had gone through the European Parliament, we would be the ones to blame for why within a span of 5-10 years, Europeans would be the ones standing at the end seats on the waiting list for new innovative medicines, because if the novel medicines would then go to other continents than Europe, because the attractiveness on data protection in Europe was shorter than in other countries and other continents.
If you go back to 1980, according to Arthur Damrich from Harvard, 60% of global pharmaceuticals were invented in Europe. Let's only take those drugs for our research. Let's just focus on those that had innovation patents that were invented in the EU and then were exploited in the EU 27. So that's not including now the UK or Switzerland. So we went from 364 in our cohort. And what did we find? We found that gave us 17 drugs. That was it from the 364 that fit that criteria. So there's been an enormous drop in overall EU productivity and origination here. Do you think there's an understanding of the real problem here, that the fact is there has been an exodus of intellectual property and innovation? Is this understood broadly?
If broadly also covers key persons in the Commission is a part of that group, then we have to say no.
Really?
That can be mended. I hope for the trilogue that will start late this year will build on the understanding that the European Parliament made during our work, that of course we cannot tie innovation to Europe, but we can make it as attractive and logically to innovate and develop your factories where you have developed your medication. And hopefully in the future that will be, of course, also in EU, because we can see it is not the case now. It was once the case. Yeah. And we have to go back to the historical roots and the DNA of Europe, that we are the continent of innovation. So of course, in the future, novel medicines of any kind should have happened only with a collaboration with the EU. And that's why the conditions for the RDP is a part of that equation. But it also is very important that the environment that you can create around factories, also in production, so in generics, is where you also make an ecosystem for life science, both education, innovation, this bigger understanding of what is it that healthcare technologies can do for Europe. Because if we don't have life sciences of very high quality in Europe, there is a lot of other adjacent competences then would also lose. Because we should imagine it's just like having a very clever child in your group of children. And the brightest one intellectually, if they can't find a school or a university or a company to work for growing older in Europe, they will leave Europe.
Yeah.
Nothing holds them back. So they can go either to US or to Asia or wherever, but not in Europe if we don't have this innovative life science ecosystem. And that has to work on the basis of what the Pharma package as a regulation toolbox can offer, so that both the generics and the innovative companies can see it really, really pays off to cooperate with Europe when developing new medicines. But also that if we go into generics, we can be sure that there is energy enough for an affordable price, there is water to our production sites, there is the workforce also available, and there is a logistic and a collaboration between all these many member states that the EU consists of that makes it easy for us to distribute our products to the end user. So that is really what I hope could be the next curve that the European co-legislators take with each other, because it's not only a matter of the Commission, vice versa, the European Parliament. Now it's up to the Council, so all 27 member states, to also embark on a learning curve with each other, helping each other to get to know how can we learn from each other and how can we not risk to damage the pharmaceutical package just because we want to have short wins.
Yeah.
And there is a lot of short win thinking in the European democracy, unfortunately, for the moment. It's so easy to talk about populism, but the horizon for many, many politicians is to the next election.
Yeah, 2 to 3 years.
So the effect of a pharmaceutical package that will really pay off in 10 years, they want to see cheap medicine on the shelves in 2 months.
If you look at that desire to have extremely cheap medicines on the shelf and to build a generic sector, these are discussions that are going on both in Europe right now and in the US. The problem is there's a certain point where being too cheap becomes really expensive. And you're already seeing it where you drive down the price to a level where you start getting shortages. You get one production problem at a factory in India, and it kills 60% of your supply for injectable cancer products.
There's a lot of products actually where Europe is completely depending that we can import from outside, and we don't acknowledge that risk at all, and we should.
Again, much like prescription medicines and on-patent medicines, there's a price for that because if you don't create the incentives and you're not willing to invest, you're not going to get the ecosystem impacts. It's just not going to happen.
True. I must say EPP and I did fight a long way, and we didn't get really to the maximum of potential value. We wanted quality of life to be a part of the equation that led towards pricing and reimbursement. Because putting the patient in center, having quality of life measurements into the decision process, whether to reimburse the product or not, would make it possible really to have a life circle approach to new and maybe in the beginning expensive medicine. But instead of not giving this patient this medicine, the cost of not doing that is much, much bigger because there is hospitalization, there is sick leave, there is the impact of the family, there is the fact of not taking part of being in the workforce, etc., etc. But also the quality in your life that you are so dependent on care because no one wants to give you the expensive medicine that would make it possible for you with one injection maybe once a week to get on living your life. So this quality of life toolbox to qualify why sometimes expensive medicine actually is the cheapest and most dignified solution to offer for citizens. That I really hope can grow over the trilogue, and also after the trilogue has ended on the pharma package, then this awareness that quality of life is not only a silver bullet for big industries to earn money on something that they argue is of value, but that actually we invite the patient and the patient organizations to be a part of the conversation and also to put in conversation what is economically feasible suggestions to do.
I was here at ISPOR in October. One of the academics from York University gave a lecture. Her position was, in this lecture, that Keytruda, arguably one of the most successful cancer oncology products, one of the most effective therapeutics for solid tumors in the world, her position was that its value was only £6 million a year in the UK. When you have opinions like this that are so divorced both from economic reality and the patient reality, you can literally say that we are not going to invest in cancer. We don't see it as valuable. And this is considered a learned opinion on one of the top research-driven conferences, peer-reviewed conferences in the world. And this is being stated as fact on stage. We have a real problem here. How do you see the disconnect between the economic reality of the healthcare sector in the EU and the political reality on the ground? Like, nobody wants to be health minister. The GDP per capita in Europe last year dropped 3%. I mean, this should be terrifying to people. The fact is, if we don't start investing in economic growth, how are we going to deal with these things? Because that's what GPL looks like to me. The bill looks like a zero-sum proposition, that healthcare, all it is overhead and it has no value.
I think we are in a time in history, especially in Europe, but maybe actually worldwide, where the complexity of our society, especially the speed in the conversation. So the media is putting our conversation so much on speed, so the complexity and the speed of conversation kill the evident best solution to be made. It's difficult to announce a position that says it's better to invest in expensive medicine in all countries if you don't have the time window in the conversation to tell why expensive medicine is actually what is the cheapest for a society to do, because you have to go through so many steps to make that logic appear in the conversation. So it's so much easier to just take one medication and say, this costs 100 kroner today, tomorrow. I want, as a politician, to promise you it will only cost half the amount.
The vast majority of Novo Nordisk money is being made in the US, not in Europe. Is that because Americans are stupid? No, it's because they value the product. It's not Europe that's driving the market. How do we change that mentality?
That's a trillion question. Being originally a nurse, being an academic in healthcare systems, but also have been working for many years now with innovation in complex systems. It is about having time to go in case material to educate decision makers, to educate. Not that they then as to be educated to have the same opinion as me, but really to have this broadening up their mind, understanding, okay, this is actually the complexity. This is how things are working together. So seeing this complex molecule that the healthcare systems are, no matter how they are designed, they are all a molecule of the somehow same atoms, but they are placed in different places in each molecule, and that can be done either very brilliantly and it can also be very dysfunctional. And in order to understand why right now the US pharmaceutical market is driving the global market and not Europe, and if we want Europe to do, we have to work much more on the understanding the evidence behind truly return on investment from what technology you offer a citizen with a healthcare challenge. Technology can be pharmaceuticals. It will often be somehow a pharmaceutical. It can also be something else. It can be training, it can be rehabilitation, and it can be change of lifestyle, etc., etc. But we have to understand that each diagnosis group has their tools that can be used more or less cleverly. And that this more or less cleverly used technologies, by the end of the day, results in some kind of cost.
Yeah.
And if we can combine this curiosity, how to have high quality, low cost, if that we could agree to try to pursue, then we could go through all the parts of the complex equation and say, okay, where can we adjust? Where can we do smarter? Maybe by learning by a neighbor country, or by, it's not a psychotherapist that should work with this patient. It's maybe actually someone coming from civil society talking with this patient group, because it has a better impact. We should have this more curiosity to understand the complexity. And the very silly thing is actually that most families who experience diseases and illnesses, who are dealing every day with maybe more than only 2 or 3 diagnoses, they do see the complexity.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not rocket science, but the way political media platforms work now is that they try to simplify the complexity so much that it becomes naive and even dangerous for society. So taking patients, families much more on board in the conversation, and also to use case material to explain why do we perform differently in this patient group than in another patient group? Why is this country working more and delivering more to less costs? What can we learn from that?
One of the things I found interesting when researching the GPL and before we launched our analysis, the legislation has said that we need to do this because of the impact of COVID. COVID exposed all these problems. So we need to combat the impact on our economy and to the health sector due to COVID. But when you actually started looking at the data, We found that the big drop, 50% of biotech creation, 50% of investment occurred not in 2020 from COVID, but actually occurred in 2018. And it just fell off a cliff in 2018. There's a lot of reasons for that. One is general competitiveness. Two is a big change in U.S. tax policy as well, which disincentivized companies from keeping money in Europe and pulling it back to the U.S., which they did to the tune of $750 billion. How did they miss this fact? How was this overlooked? Do you think the GPL is trying to solve the wrong problem, which is, as we've been discussing, an overall competitiveness problem?
The narrative of the COVID and using that as an argument stems primarily from what is also in the Commission's proposal, namely to have more joint procurements.
Right.
And we had joint procurement on vaccines because it made so much sense to do that. But it doesn't make sense to make joint procurement on any other kind of pharmaceutical product, and not only in times of urgency. But the Commission, from the very beginning, after the joint procurement, it was like they saw suddenly a tool and a key argument to take over member state responsibility.
Right.
To take away from the member states the possibility to decide themselves whether or not they wanted to reimburse a pharmaceutical product or not. And that's more or less because the Commission will always have this fundamental approach that the more we do for everybody else, the better for the union. But we are a union of member states. So there is a lot that we do together, but there is also typologies of societal challenges and services where we have to respect that they are better taken care of in the specific member state. Also because it's so much embedded in the local context, in the local culture, and the family models, and how the industry works with the trade unions and etc. All the civil society design, that is so much a local phenomenon, and it should continue to be so. Again, also because Europe is a continent of member states and many different cultures that are in a constant dialogue. Sometimes also in a smaller and bigger conflicts on topics, not only football, but that is what makes us so innovative, because that's in the DNA of Europeans. We want to make tomorrow better, and we can only do that if we don't act as if we are China or Russia. Going back to the corona, where we really had to stand shoulder to shoulder and focus on the urgencies and do something very uniformly together, like the joint procurement, was a good example that whatever it is important to do so, we can also, as Europeans, having our minds in different directions, we can sometimes also align and take one big step together. But that doesn't say that one big step is then in all cases, also in times of peace. The joint procurement narrative from the corona overtook the scene instead of maybe going a little bit more in the helicopter and looking on the data that could tell a more truth story about how is pharmaceutical and life science economy and ecosystems, how are they working locally in Europe, but also globally.
The proposal that came out of the European Commission, the legislation in the GPL, was obviously informed by a group of academics who really don't understand the ecosystem. That's my opinion. That's certainly research we've published that shows without the commercial market there, you just simply do not get innovation. The academic report basically said you can do all this through academia without commercial market. That's absurd. Obviously, these opinions, shall we say, salted and flavored the GPL as it came out of the European Commission. You obviously took the mantle, the head on this, and said, no, we're going to fix this. So you went in a common sense direction. Thank you. And I'm sure it wasn't easy, and I'm sure you've taken a lot of hits, but well done. You managed to sway an enormous group to I was shocked when I looked at the votes. I was like, wow, well done. I mean, it's very impressive.
But I think that was because we made this evidence-based approach, not talking so much about ideology,
right,
but talking about how does healthcare systems actually work together with industry.
If I'm an investor, and I have been an investor before I started my company, You have $1 million to put into a couple biotech companies. You're going to put it where you think you have the best opportunity.
Obvious.
And if you see that RDP or any sort of data protection is under attack, you're going to avoid that market. What do you think happens now? You put your thumbprint with your colleagues on what came out of the parliament. Now this goes to the council. What happens?
It is at the council now. They are working up their position. Hopefully the Hungarian presidency that is now in the seats will finalize their proceeding by having the council on their negotiation position by the end of this year, maybe a little bit earlier. So I think the trilogue, they can maybe have the first meeting before Christmas, but the negotiation, tough time period, very exciting times for us to follow, but maybe also to inform during the trilogue.
Sure. Any tea leaves? What do you think happens? What comes out? Is it more like yours or is it more like the original bill?
I hope that we will come more closer to our proposal, maybe even to do it better. How can the return on investment for each member state really be as low as cost as possible to the highest amount of quality in each member state? There is a potential. So even the Council and the trilogue could go further than the European Parliament's position. So I hope to see the Parliament's position at least, maybe a little bit more.
Recorded from the floor of the 2024 Bio International Conference, I spoke with Niklas Blomberg, the Executive Director of the EU's Innovative Health Initiative, a short time after his taking command. The podcast was initially released on July 3rd, 2024. I'm familiar, and many people are familiar with the Innovative Medicines Initiative, a real prototype in public-private partnerships that the EU ran for many years. Now it's the Innovative Health Initiative. How has it differed and how has it evolved?
First is to say it's really very much of the same. We like to think about ourselves as the world's largest public-private partnership for health research. And the Innovative Health Initiative is really an evolution of IMI, the Medicines Initiative. And the big difference is really that we broaden out the initiative. So previously we partnered with the pharma industry and the research-based pharmaceutical companies in Europe, and now we're taking a much more comprehensive view on health. And so we're bringing in medical technologies, we're bringing in the device makers, the imaging and the radiology companies. So that's a really exciting development. So it helps us taking a sort of broad look at healthcare and run some really interesting projects.
One of the challenges between pharmaceuticals, which has been the core focus of the IMI, and then bringing in the diagnostics, the device, the imaging, it's the speed at which they work as well as the regulatory pressures. They haven't always played well together, and you come from drug discovery. Mm-hmm. This is something you know extremely well. How are you getting them to sort of play nice together in the same sandbox?
Yeah, it is a challenge. It's a real challenge. And I think we just need to look around at bio here and see the acceleration of technology. They work typically in very different timeframes. They also work with different payer and regulatory systems and
different IP approaches too as well.
And very different uptake approaches in the European healthcare system. So I think that's a real challenge and we're looking at that. That said, I think we've found a couple of sweet spots in the early projects. So we have a really interesting project on real data in lung cancer.
Interesting.
And so that's bringing together pharma, but also device makers and even patient organizations, but even health technology assessment bodies. And so it's really taking quite a broad look at some of the fundamental problems. So what is the type of data that you can collect? How can you collect that in an acceptable way for the patients? And how can you use that both to understand the value of the medical treatments as well as the value of the different devices as they are being deployed in the healthcare system?
It's really interesting you mentioned the HTAs. I would think that they would very much appreciate having sort of a one-stop shop. Is that the feedback you've been getting?
One of the things that we try to do in IHI is really to be that neutral broker, a platform where...
A convening body.
Platform where a lot of different organizations that normally struggle to work together, even though they know they need to work together. So it's very hard for, say, a regulator to work with one or two companies.
Right. They
need to take a much more open and broad approach. We provide that, and so we have a lot of our projects are bringing in together regulators, a broad set of companies, but then also the actors from civil society, representation from the healthcare systems, representation from the patient bodies. That allows a different type of dialogue, and I think it allows both the regulators to understand the value proposition from the companies, but also for the healthcare systems and the companies to understand some of the constraints around regulation and validation. So I think that's really one of the areas where we can be active.
Now, IMI was pre-competitive in biopharmaceuticals. That was sort of the objective. Now that you have all the technology players there, have the objectives shifted a bit? What do you see are the core goals that you're trying to hit?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, if you bring together 5-10 companies into one project, public-private partnership, it's going to be pre-competitive.
Sure.
This is not about product development. This is about addressing some of the sort of fundamentals in the landscape. Before, in IMI, a lot of those questions were around disease mechanism and validation and understanding the stratification of disease. That's still there, and I think that ability to bring in also the medical technology and the diagnostics companies has almost strengthened that. So we can look at advanced biomarkers. We have a call this summer launching on patient-centric outcomes using digital technologies. I think that's, again, one of these areas where both the pharma sector and the technology sector are coming together. How can you use some of these digital endpoints to really understand the lived experience of patients and the lived experience of disease? And can you actually validate that in a way that it can be used as an endpoint in clinical trials or a regulatory process? Those are really important questions that all of the companies, regardless of sector, want to approach. And I think if we find ways forward, I think that can really transform the way we're doing healthcare research in Europe.
And because it's a public-private partnership and it's pre-competitive, you create this, I don't want to say safe space, it's almost a cliche, but in some ways it's an area where, okay, we can all live in this box and work together, and then we can go our own merry way and do our own things afterwards.
Yeah, the words might be a cliche, but I think it's there is a real genuine need for that. I mean, safe space, safe harbor, neutral platform, call it whatever you want, but I think there is a real need, if we look at the healthcare systems, to convene all the actors to look at the challenges.
You used to work at a very high level in drug discovery, particularly with AstraZeneca and other companies as well. I mean, you came from the private sector. Why did you decide to join the public sector? What was the motivation?
Honestly, I don't think I ever looked at it that way, Dwayne.
Sure, okay.
So I think that the driver for me was always the job. I worked for AstraZeneca. That was about 13 years ago. I left AstraZeneca to move over to the UK to set up an intergovernmental research organization for genomics. And I remember at the time I thought, well, you only get this question once in your career to start a new organization internationally from scratch. So it was pretty much a no-brainer at that point. And I think IHI for me was really the same thing. It's a really interesting program. It's got some really exciting projects running. And you only get the opportunity to be part of and shape that research landscape for health in Europe once in your career. That's more the driver than public-private.
Sweden is such a dynamic country for biodiscovery and bioengineering. Do you miss rolling up your sleeves and getting in the bench? I mean, do you miss it a bit? Come on, you have to.
Yes, of course I do. Of course you do. But yeah, and I haven't been to, I mean, it's a long time since I left Sweden, so I do get homesick at times.
Well, Nikolai Brunn, who you may know, who's a former regulator from the Danish agency, who keeps one foot in and out, he sort of hops into regulation and out. Now, he's working with a startup in antibodies, which could be the next generation monoclonal antibodies. There's some fantastic technology there. Are you excited by what you're seeing as the emerging technology now in the EU? I mean, in general.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at. So we had a great meeting earlier this year. We called it the Regulatory Science Summit. But that is really about bringing together both industry, regulators, and health technology assessors, but also researchers. The key question we had in that meeting was really, what is the science that we need to start now to make sure that we can provide sort of regulatory pathways of the products of tomorrow? And we have a couple of projects around that, and we're launching.
What are those projects? That's interesting.
So we're launching one this summer called Regulatory Sandbox. So we're really trying to think about how will a regulatory sandbox work inside. As you know, there is quite a lot of regulation coming in Europe right now.
I've heard, yes.
and so a question, I think that's a question both for the regulators and for industries, is really how do you take these innovative products through a regulatory pathway? So we're launching a project around that, both to set the frameworks and then some pilot projects.
So if people are interested in these, is there some way for them to come into IHI? Because I understand you're working on some of these projects that are launching with smaller SME-based companies. This is one of the innovations that's occurred since IMI with the IHI. How do people reach out to you if they wanted to get involved in the projects?
So one thing is that, as a program, what we are trying to do is to fund large collaborative projects. That's inherent in the program. If you're working in a large collaborative project, you need to start early. You need to reach out to your network and to your collaborators and see, how do I bring together, how do I get to be part of a consortia, or how do I build a consortia with all the different expertises that's needed. And I think that's really the key. If you look at our calls and you look at our topics, you will see that they are inherently interdisciplinary. And so that means that you need to be able to work with people from other sectors. So I think that's the first, really work through your network and try to activate that. The second space is make use of all the resources that we are putting forward. And some of these resources are really meant there for partnering and brokering. We're running brokering events which are really meant for small companies, academics with brilliant ideas, but also for small companies to come and present themselves and get to know other organizations and individuals who are interested in our calls. And those are advertised well in advance of our calls. That's really an important inroads. And I should say that small companies can be funded under IHI. So the big players will contribute in kind as part of the public-private partnership.
Yeah.
But small and mid-sized companies, they really come in as beneficiaries, and we welcome SMEs to join, and they can be funded for the work they're doing in our projects.
And you point out something really interesting. In the U.S., the distinctions between public and private partnership are often defined by the National Institutes of Health. In many ways, the European Commission is adopting these positions. That's sort of the role you're trying to serve on some level. How do you personally, given the fact you too have had one foot in the public and one foot in the private sector, how do you see the role between the two in Europe? How do you see them working?
I really believe in comprehensive and inclusive public healthcare systems. If you start from that, really an important part of society is to provide comprehensive and inclusive care for all the citizens. Then you need to start to think, well, how do you manage that long term? That's really where the public-private partnership comes in. So we know, and we just need to look around a bit here, Dwayne, the amount of innovation that's happening in the private sector. And so I think the question is, how do we make sure that innovation really works within the healthcare system and that it ultimately reaches the patients, and how can we match that up with important unmet public health needs? And I think that's really what we're trying to do. We're defining some unmet public health needs, and then we're trying to bring together both the public sector actors but the strength of innovation that we see in the private sector and drive that towards these outcomes.
Well, Scandinavia has been incredibly successful at this in many respects. It manages to split the baby, as we say in the States. You've managed to keep the public health, but arguably Novo Nordisk, a Danish company now, last time I checked, its market capitalization is larger than the entire GDP of Denmark broadly. I mean, a hugely successful company. You've got tremendous entrepreneurial activity in Sweden. I guess the question is, how do you see a role of IHI managing to amplify that more broadly across the EU?
Part of what we're doing, so we are not a capacity building program, we are an excellence driven program, and so our calls are always evaluated, the projects and the submissions are always evaluated based on excellence, not about capacity building. There are other programs in the European Union that are targeting that. But that said, I think if you look at the public health needs, the diversity is incredibly important. And we have a topic opening this summer on cardiovascular prevention and care. And really the core of that topic is to compare prevention, care and outcomes in different systems in Europe. And so to work with the private sector, but also work with public sectors and try to understand how does different treatment intervention work in different healthcare systems. That's part of what we're doing. We're trying to spread that excellence. And the other is that we are quite inclusive in our calls. We see excellence isn't only confined to the larger cities in Northwest Europe. Yeah. We sit across from the
Estonian booth, exactly.
Estonian booth here. It's amazing innovation happening in the Baltic region. There is a big Spanish pavilion here. There is a center of AI in Europe, is perhaps in Paris, and then also in some of the Spanish regions. Europe is quite diverse, and we really try to draw on that skill set and the diversity.
You mentioned AI, you mentioned Estonia. One of the challenges we're seeing in Europe still, and we hear this regularly from our clients, is the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. You've brought in data companies and data mining as part of the service. How are you dealing with that in the prospect of building up calls and new technologies? How are you, in a pre-competitive environment, managing that and making sure it's not an impediment?
If you think about Europe, there has been quite a lot of regulation in that data space recently. You had GDPR, you have now the European Health Data Space Regulation just coming into force, you have the AI Act and things like that. And there are two things to think about when it comes to regulation, or maybe three things. So the first is, of course, that it takes time to translate that regulation into operational procedures. And I think we see that sort of friction in the system now. The other thing that is difficult is try to understand how do the different regulations work together. What is the intersection between, say, the AI Act and the GDPR?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a question many companies. This is where these sort of regulatory sandbox concepts are really important, and so that's part of what we're trying to fund.
Interesting. So you're going to try and put together coalitions and calls and consortiums to deal around those issues and experiment them. That's interesting.
Yeah, and I think that's perhaps an important role. If you think about regulation, I mean, as a society, you regulate with a purpose. You try to set up guardrails to create the society that you want to live in. That creates friction to innovation, of course, because there are guardrails around. And so what you need to do is really double down on the innovation investments. And I think IHI is part of that doubling down. It's part of our job is to drive consortia in this space and trying to work with all the actors to understand how you can operate with data. One area where we've traditionally invested quite a lot is real-world data, real-world evidence.
Sure.
And we see a lot of consortia in this space. They really challenge the notion that you can't share data across borders in Europe, because we see some of our projects have over 800 million patient records available in a federated system. So that's you can definitely share data at a very large scale, or access data at a very large scale. If you want to use this data not only for regulatory purposes, but also to understand diseases or understand, say, the effect of knee replacements and the knee surgery to improve procedures. How do you do that together with the device manufacturers or the prosthetics manufacturer in a way that the patient trusts to set up and understand how that should operate? I think that's a really important role for IHI because, again, all of our projects are public-private partnership. We bring together companies, we bring together researchers, hospitals, but we also bring together that part of civil society, so the patient organizations and the payers.
So if a small company or a new technology would want to get involved in these calls, how can they become a part of IHI? How do they do this practically?
Well, you roll up your sleeve and you write a really good application. I think that's what... No, I mean, and it's easy to say, but unfortunately, our calls are really competitive.
Sure.
And that shows that this is a space where you could probably live with larger investments. The best advice is really to look at our website to make sure that you attend the brokering events.
Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.